exploratory trip. Super excited this morning. I'm going to do a little tag team teaching. I am going to beat you into submission, and my friend Amber is going to jump off the top ropes and get you with the elbow. It's going to be exciting. I mentioned last week that I'm super interested in movements that affect the global church, what God is doing around the world. Much of what we have considered movements are blips on the radar of what God is doing. You know, some guy gets 2 churches, hosts a conference, and decides it's a movement. Nobody in Nigeria knows he's alive, okay? These movements, I'm thinking global, are things that really have intrigued me. And this morning, we join the global church to recognize and talk about Pure Religion Sunday, or what has been known for years as Orphan Sunday. I want to give you a little global history, then I'm going to give you a little family history, and then our friend Amber is going to talk a little bit about how we can write some of the forward books of history. Because history is written by somebody. Why not us? This morning, first, global history. When you hear of global movements to care for children that our society would say they do not want, because you are good Americans, you assume it started in America, right? Because doesn't everything? Actually, Orphan Sunday, or Pure Religion Sunday, started in Zambia. A pastor named Billy Chandwa was painfully aware of the plight of the children in his own community, in his own church. These were kids that were struggling with poverty. Many of them were orphans due to the AIDS crisis. And he started this in response to local children right in front of him. He organized a day for his congregation who were poverty-stricken, struggling people, and said, what can we do for those amongst us? It wasn't a big marketing campaign. This was an African pastor asking Africans, what can we do with these children? That event struck a chord, and the people of that church gave radically out of their own need. Now, that Sunday, there was a visitor there in that church that said, we need to take this to other churches. And for the next 5 or 6 years, it spread across Zambia, a movement to take care of kids locally. Africa was taking care of its own as best it could. This morning, thousands of churches, over 100 nations, we join with them for the plight of children that deserve better than life has given them. Like the churches of Africa, we're asking, what can we do on behalf of needy kids right in front of us? We love that Sally and Tyler feel called to Africa right now. We love that. We love that people are called to go and that people are called to stay. We've said it before, we're more concerned with our sending capacity than with our seating capacity. But for those who stay seated, there is a calling. And that calling is right here. The crisis is not limited to Africa. Around the world, even in our own city, there are children who are at great risk, and the heart of the church is unified. Something should be done. Nobody sits among us and said, we shouldn't do anything. But the tragedy continues, and my question for you is this, as we wade into this, what might God be asking you to do? My hope this morning is to inspire a series of awkward conversations in your home. That you would sit and wrestle with some of what we're going to talk about. Not everybody's calling to this is the same. Absolutely not. But for some, there are very specific things that you're going to be called to do. And you may be sitting there this morning and saying, I really don't have the resources to address a global orphan crisis. I would bet that's true. Like, I'm pretty positive of that of most of us. But God has a history of taking meager resources and multiplying them to meet needs. There's very few stories that are told in all the Gospels. There's overlap in different places, but there's very few that are told in all 4. There's a good number that are told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John just doesn't touch them. However, there is one that is told in all 4. Probably a few more, but one specifically I find interesting. It's when the disciples were asked to take on the task of feeding the 5,000, and their universal response is, this is impossible. And they all mention that they've caught 5 loaves and a couple of fishes, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't even mention whose fishes they are. They just say, we've got this little bit here. John actually does mention who it is. Not by name, but he credits somebody. John 6, 8, 9 says, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said, there is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many? Everybody wants to feed the 5,000, but very few are willing to give up their lunch, because they don't think their lunch matters. Can you imagine? I would bet there were actually other people in that crowd of 5,000 that had a lunch. 5,000 people don't go spending the day without any thought of food. But apparently there was one saying, what can you do with what I have? And that kid will be remembered forever. Let me give you, that's the global history, okay? Let me give you a little family history. And this is our own personal family. And many of you have heard this story or parts of this story before. Maybe some of you have not heard any of it. We've got a number who have joined us in recent months. I'm not telling this story for any reason other than to say these are the moments that marked our lives, and I'm believing for moments to mark your life. Not to tag on to my thing, but that the Lord would begin to mark moments in your life that change the trajectory of where you're going, and by benefit of that, change the directory of children. It's kind of a big weekend for us. I didn't recognize this till just the other day or so ago, but I mentioned to Kelsey, 20 years ago, this week, was a marker for us. It was a turning point. And I'm believing for turning points for you. Every crazy, faith-filled thing you've ever done began in a moment. Began in a moment. In the fall of 2004, Lou Engle had gathered a group of young people and lived in a little farm in Bowie, Maryland. Kids slept on the floor, ate oatmeal, fasted, prayed, and they did that through the fall, praying for the elections that we were going into that fall. And at the time, there was a young woman who was living in our basement, 20-something gal, who had been my assistant in Cincinnati. She moved here to Kansas City to be with us. And one day she goes, I'd do anything to go and pray with those kids. And something stirred Kelsey and I. At this point, we had 3 boys. Life was a little harder for us to be that mobile. But we invested in her, and we gave her money to go do that. That was our lunch. Here, we want to give you this. Not enough to change the world, but you go. And so she did. Nothing given to the Lord ever really disappears from your life. Fast forward to Tuesday, November 2nd, 2004. It was election day, 20 years ago. Kelsey wakes up, rolls over, and looks at me and says, I feel compelled to go pray with those young people today. I'm like, those young people are in Washington, D.C. She goes, I know. I said, election day is today. She said, I know. I think it took her till about 11 o'clock that morning to get on a plane. And she, with a friend, flies to Washington, D.C., finds this young woman, and she prays with these young people. She's there about 36 hours, and she gets on a plane and flies back. Okay, that is November 2nd. This starts a series of events, tumbleweeding, so that on January 1st, Kelsey and I and our 3 boys load up a very small U-Haul with a few of our meager possessions, and we move to Washington, D.C. for a year to lead an internship for Lou with about 70 college kids from all over the world. Kelsey's life is one that is marked by radical obedience. The girl does not need to hear twice, okay? I'm a little slower. We joke, we say that Kelsey's the first one on the bus, I am the last one on the bus. When I get on the bus, we will go. But we get on the bus. The young people that the Lord sent us to pray with, I can't speak highly enough about them. Those 70 kids have gone on, now it's 20 years later, they're all in their late 30s or early 40s, and they are heading up missions organizations around the world. They're leading worship on a massive level. Like those kids have turned out, Tanner Peak is one of them. Tanner runs Every Home for Christ. It is the largest door-to-door evangelism organization in the world. They're in 200 different countries. Christine DeMarco is a worship leader with Bethel for years. She led our night watch through the night in a little stinky prayer room. The kids that the Lord sent were just of the unbelievable quality. When you pray about an issue, because we were there praying on a day-to-day basis, standing on the steps of the Supreme Court, praying for the ending of abortion. When you begin to pray about an issue, the Lord begins to move in your heart about how you can be part of the answer to your own prayers. Just be warned, okay? When you start to pray for things, you start to have crazy ideas that you did not have before you started to pray for them. And we knew that one of the things we were wrestling with was not just the issue of abortion, which was horrific in itself, but the issue that by and large, we don't regard children the way the Lord regards children. We don't value them at the level the Lord values them. Let me tell you how the Lord looks at children for a minute. Psalm 127, 3 through 5. Behold, children are a heritage of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. It doesn't even say which wombs. Every child in the womb is a reward from the Lord. It says, like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Do you understand what a difference arrows made when it came to warfare? Before we had arrows, we had to physically get close enough to beat on each other with a stick. Like that was the nature of war. It was very immediate. But when somebody designed arrows, suddenly you could take an arrow and you could shoot an arrow faster and further than you could ever run. So when he calls them arrows, what he's saying is they are something that you can fire into the future and you can do warfare in a place where you will never ever live. When I look at my 10 children, this is between me and you right now, it's hard, okay? It's busy at our house. Boredom is not a problem. But I am stringing arrows that I will fire, and 150 years from now, they'll look back and say, he must have been a genius. This was brilliant to plan out so far ahead. Had an appliance salesman one time ask us, you guys have a daycare? I said, no, they're all ours. He looked at me and goes, what are you thinking? I looked him in the eyes, I said, total world domination. I was only half kidding. Children are arrows that you can fire where you, folks, the kids in your home right now will have impact based on the spiritual DNA that you put in them in a place where you will never live. Do you really think you're going to be fighting battles in 80 years? Or even 40? They will be. January of 2005, we've only been there a few weeks. We're standing on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court. We're praying, and we prayed silently. No signs, no anything. Red tape on our mouths that said life. And yet, every time we did it, it felt like protesters would gather. And keep in mind, at this point, abortion had been legal for about 50 years. How manic do you have to be to yell at people when you're winning and have been for 50 years? But these pro-abortion protesters would gather behind us and they would yell. And I remember them yelling, at the time Jackson, some of you know Jackson now, Jackson was about 12. They're standing behind Jackson at 12 and they yell in his ear, what are you going to do if you win? You don't want these kids any more than the mothers do. And when I heard that, something welled up in me because I had to ask, is that true? Is that really true? Everybody wants to feed the 5,000. Nobody wants to give up their lunch. That protester had no idea what they started. We went home that night. We started talking about, do we adopt? Started praying with these young people. Lord, is this for us? You know, we looked around the room, and if anybody was going to adopt, it was probably us because they were all, 18 and unmarried and struggling trying to figure out what life was going to be like. That night, young man, shaggy-headed Korean kid who's just graduated with a degree in political science from Lafayette, walked up to me. His name is Brian Kim. Some of you know Brian. I knew Brian back then. He walked up and gave me a check for $500, and he says, this is seed money for a big van you're going to need someday. No idea that we would drive a big van for 15 years. I blame Brian. Everybody wants to feed the 5,000, but nobody wants to surrender their lunch. Brian surrendered his lunch. Did he think $500 was going to solve the orphan crisis on the earth? No. But he believed God could do something with it. We returned to Kansas City in October of 2005, continued to pray about the idea of adoption, decided the next summer, maybe the time is now. I remember in May of that year, Kelsey, who again was already on the bus before I was, said, hey, I'm going to speak in Texas at a conference. Can you do something for me this weekend? I thought she was going to say, can you do the laundry? I said, yes, whatever, honey. She said, can you go to this 1.5-hour meeting at Summit Church in Lee's Summit about adoption? I've been tricked. I said, I'll go. I go to this meeting. I have no memory of the content. I couldn't tell you who was in the room. Couldn't even tell you who put on the... All I remember is by the time I got to the truck, when it was over, I was weeping. Could barely climb into this as the Lord invited us into this idea of caring for children. That was May. June, we started filling out paperwork, started raising money. And by October 2nd, I'm standing in our bedroom at 4:20. Was it October 2nd? Maybe I got the date wrong. Might have been the 4th. It was a Tuesday. 4:20, I'm standing there. The phone rings. It's a social worker who I've never heard from in my life. I don't know who she is. She said, there's a little girl in Las Vegas, if you would want her. I remember tears in my eyes going, we want her. We got on a plane the next morning. We'd been raising money all summer. Friends had been giving us their lunch. I remember the first little gal who wrote me a check for $75 to contribute to our adoption. She says, this is all I've got, take it. I took it. She says, can you wait till Friday to cash it? I said, we will. And people have been helping us all summer. The woman told us what the fees were. The fees were outrageous. We were $7,000 short. I didn't tell her we didn't have the money. I didn't lie to her. I just didn't burden her with the facts. We got to the airport, and a friend emailed us and said, I just watched a documentary on the potential of revival in Las Vegas, and I want to sow into Las Vegas by sending you $7,000. We got on the plane with every dollar we needed. Got there, and I remember going to the nursery and asking, we're here to meet so-and-so, and the woman at the desk saying, there's no baby available for adoption here. My heart just sunk. I thought, we've been scammed. I don't know how we've been scammed. We haven't given anybody any money. But, it was my first thought. I feel like we've been scammed. She goes, oh, maybe she's in the nursery upstairs. I'm like, oh, thank you, lady. We run up the stairs, and a nurse walks us in. There's nothing like walking into a nursery full of bassinets, knowing your daughter is one of them, and you don't know which one. And she walks up and hands us this little girl and walks us back into a little room, and we just start to weep. In part because we've got a daughter, but also because now a daughter has a mother and a father. We brought Zoe home, which is a crazy story in itself. And it opened our hearts to this idea of James 1:27, a pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, to keep oneself unspotted from the world. The word "and" there was added later by the scribes. It's actually a mashup in the original language. That doing this act is an act of sanctification for the church. So that's the global history of Pure Religion Sunday. It's a little family history of why we beat this drum. Why some of you are having to explain to your friends why your pastor and his family are a little crazy about this idea of children. This is why. Because this is what the Lord has called us to. I want to ask our friend Amber to come and talk a little bit about forward history. I cannot tell you how much admiration I have for this woman. And I've never really... Why do you love people so long and never tell them? It's so dumb. This is what I love about it. Amber is one of the few on the earth that is both an academic and a practitioner. The church has a bad habit of either studying something and never doing anything about it, or diving in to do something about something, but never really having done the homework. Amber was sitting at a table years ago with people trying to figure out how to crack this nut and how to work with kids and how to make a difference. And if I've got the story, you decided to go back to school.
Yeah.
To get a master's in social work. Looked around and said, if we're going to do this, we need to know what we're doing. She goes and gets I hope I'm not like stealing your stuff. She goes, does the homework, and at the same time is a practitioner of what she gets it and she does it. There's a unique equity in that. And I've asked her to share a little bit this morning about what that looks like.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here with you. I recognize several faces, and there's others that I don't know, but my name is Amber. As Randy was talking about these moments that mark us and shift the trajectory of our life, I was thinking of a moment where the Lord called me actually in Africa. I wasn't planning on this. I wasn't thinking of it till this morning. Hello. Okay. Thanks, Lyle. I was in Africa when the Lord first called me to, I used to call them underprivileged kids. I immediately thought orphanage. That's what we do with underprivileged kids, right? And they're in Africa. So I went to Africa. We ended up buying 10 acres of land there, and we were building like a children's home. And I was in my hotel room one night in Sierra Leone, Western Coast, and reading the story of Jesus setting the demonized man free in Mark, in the Decapolis. And the demonized man was so grateful. He said, I want to come with you. I want to follow your ministry. And Jesus said to him, you go home and you tell your people what I did for you. You testify. And in that moment, the Lord told me in Africa, Amber, go home. They're in your backyard. And I was like, they are? I had no idea where the kids in the United States were that were orphaned. We don't see them in the street. We don't call them orphans. And they're cared for by the government. So I came home, and that's what launched me into my journey here in foster care. So it's been about 15 years since I've been in this field. And like Randy said, I started in the place of prayer, really. And the Lord gave me Proverbs 19:2. I was thinking of it this morning. He said, zeal without knowledge is not good, nor is it to be hasty and miss the way. So my plan to build orphanages all over the world may not have been the Lord's plan. It was later that he said, I set the lonely in families. The way an orphan becomes a son and a daughter is through a mom or a dad. And so I knew that the Lord was calling me to help raise up the family, the church, the family of families, to take in the children. So the next moment when I was preparing for today, what I was going to share, I was remembering back to the actual night. Well, I've been an adoptive parent, foster adoptive parent for 10 years. My daughter's over there. She's 14 now. She came to me when she was this big. Talk about a meager offering. When I picked her up, it was an emergency placement. I brought her back to a room I was staying at with a widow and her 14 kids. I had just gotten my W-2 that year, and it was painfully low. It was like, I was like, could it have actually been $19,000? Like, I was poor, single, didn't have anything. And all of a sudden, I pick up a 4-year-old, and I get the question, will you keep her? And I remember shutting the door, saying, I can't talk to anybody. This was not the plan. And I go to the altar in my heart, and the Lord starts saying, lay things down. Just lay it down. And I begin to break up with the future I thought I was going to live. I was giving him, I thought I'd be married first. I thought I'd have more than $19,000 a year first. I thought I'd have a house first. And he said, I want you to say yes first, and then I will multiply that offering. So I ended up saying yes. We're 10 years in. The reason I said yes was because when I was pouring out my life at the altar, that prayer time, that moment alone with the Lord, I had a picture of a man in the church holding an umbrella over me. And he opened the door of the church and he said, come in. And it was to me and Kaylin. And the Lord said, I promise I will care for you by the church. I promise I will cover you with my church. You're not alone. I felt so alone and so afraid. And the Lord just said, I will cover you. And 10 years later, I can testify the church has covered us. We have not lacked anything. The Lord provided a home for us within 3 months, paid for. The Lord provided finances, doubled my income without effort, because I was in missions at the time. And to this day, the Lord has provided the relationships, the finances, the energy. I am a single mom to this day, and the Lord is the father of our home. And I can testify to that. He does it day in and day out. So I wanted just to read a little something from Matthew 25 before I go into a little bit about foster kids and what's going on today. I've been poring over this passage. I didn't know I was going to speak until maybe Thursday this week, and I had already been in this passage. So I want to read Matthew 25, verse 31 through 40, and talk a little about the Lord's heart for the vulnerable. And then we'll talk practical real quick about what we're doing with Another Way Home. It's a new program we're launching. Well, it's been in the works, developing. So Matthew 25, verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his throne in heavenly glory. All nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people from one another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will reply, I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these, brothers of mine, you did for me. Whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. I look at that passage and I'm like, what is our king? That he would yoke himself to the experience of the needy, the naked, the thirsty. He would feel every time they felt if they were cared for. He would feel it every time he yoked himself to them. What does this tell us about our king? That at the end, when he brings people to his throne, he's going to separate one by one by what they did, by if they cared for the needy. Now, that is not what justifies us, right? But it's like a litmus of the justified. Caring for the needy is not, it's not a calling, it's a characteristic of the righteous. And there's many expressions of this. Adoption isn't the only expression. In fact, that's one of my passions, is to get the church to say yes to the families within their church that are called to it, so they don't bear the burden alone. We can care together for the child. As the church cares for the family that says yes, that family can care for the child, and true transformation can happen, not just for the child, but for the community. I have been thinking about how we need such a reframing of the vulnerable. They are a gift to us. They are not a burden. The vulnerable is like we have this mutual need of them, that we need them as much as they need us, because they bring a missing testimony of the Father to our church, to our congregation. These kids will know something about the Father that I will never know. The vulnerable, the hungry, the thirsty, they will know something when he has met their needs, when he has delivered them. They bring a testimony that I will never know. But together with all the saints, we will know what is the height, the length, the depth, the width of love. So when these kids are missing from our family, we're actually missing a piece of the knowledge of God. And that is my heart. Why does the gospel demand proximity to the poor? Why does the gospel demand, over and over, there's scriptures, you can't get around it, his heart for the poor, the orphan, the widow, the foreigner. That's the quartet of the vulnerable. Why does he say it over and over again, commissioning us, not just certain ones and departments with a calling, commissioning his people to carry his heart? Why? Because there is a knowledge of God that's unlocked when we become his hands and feet, when we are the body of Christ on the earth. There's a knowledge of God that we obtain that you can't get if you're sitting in a prayer room for 100 years. When I put my hand on the poor, when I hold Kaylin, when I reach out and touch the lonely and the lost, there is something that moves through me, through embodying my shepherd. When I give to them, there's something that suddenly I now have that I did not have before. There's a revelation of God there, waiting for you, waiting for me. Jeremiah 29:11 says, "Is this not what it means to know me, to care for the poor?" So as we step in to be his hands and feet, we embody the heartbeat of our Father. He died not just for us. He died for the least of these. And he yokes himself to every experience they have, and he yokes himself to their lack as well. And he separates the people of God to say, was it true? Pure and undefiled religion, James 1:27, is this: to care for the orphan and the widow. It's going to look a lot of different ways. But he says, I'm the father of this family. I decide what this family looks like. I decide what the characteristic of this family is. And my family cares for the orphan and the widow. It's going to be a primary mark on my people. And it will actually be the reflection of the Father to this world. It's going to testify of a coming kingdom. And I'm going to do it in my church. I'm going to raise up my church to testify of a coming kingdom, and they will know me because they've laid hands on these ones, and these ones, when they're raised up, they will testify of a good father who would never leave or forsake his children. So that scripture has just been, we don't get a pass on it. Even me, I'm like, I don't get a pass on it. My yes 15 years ago is not my yes today. Like, I have to say yes today. I actually picked up my Bible this morning, my college Bible. I have like different Bibles for different seasons of my life. And I when I was reading it, on the bottom it says from November 2007, look at your hands, Amber. And actually look at your hands while I'm saying this. This is what the Lord told me reading this. Look at your hands, Amber. There I am. It like suddenly clicked, like, he is in me. I am the embodiment of the King. And I think when we worship, we think of this being our worship. Singing, which is beautiful, right? Singing, lifting our hands to the Lord. But the Lord told me, Amber, every morning when you give her her breakfast, her cup of water, her milk, she loves milk, when I give her her breakfast, that is the same as this. It is all worship. We have separated the first and second commandment. And the Lord said, Amber, you don't have to choose. The next passage is in Matthew 26, is Mary of Bethany at the feet of Jesus. She pours out her alabaster box, and the disciples rebuke her. I mean, they just heard the least of these sermon, right? No, give to the poor. And the Lord says, don't stop her worship. The poor you'll always have with me. And he lets Mary of Bethany worship the King himself. You don't have to choose. He's saying, you do both. First and second commandment. We keep trying to separate it, and no, it's both. We need the first to do the second. We need the second to do the first. We need them together, integrated. So foster kids. I often say I would love to just rip that label off to expose foster kids who for who they truly are. They are the most vulnerable, in my opinion, of the nations. They are the poorest, the most afflicted, the oppressed, the lonely, the prisoner. In my opinion, the most unreached people group in our nation. The pain for me, for foster kids, is they are bearing the consequence of someone else's sin and a broken system. These kids have been beaten, they've been starved, and now they languish and they wait. The goal of foster care is to restore broken families while the kid is safe. That is the goal. And 50% of the kids are reunified with their biological family, and they get to go home with their biological family. 50% don't. So numbers-wise, in our nation, there's 400,000 foster kids, and 115,000 of them right now are waiting for a family. So their parental rights have been terminated, and so they're not going home, and they're waiting and eligible for a family. Which means in our nation, we have about 400,000 churches. Because again, thinking of the global crisis seems really overwhelming until you realize the Lord has given resource and provision to the church to do what he commissioned us to. So there's 400,000 churches. As the Lord turns our hearts to the children, only one family in 3 churches actually has to take a child in waiting for adoption for there to be no more waiting children. Let me say that again. One family in every 3 churches in America adopt, and there will be no more waiting children in our system. Okay, that is so doable. Here's my question. What does the rest of the church do? Because remember, we all want to enter into this because the knowledge of God is the actual invitation and reward. What do the rest of us do? We mobilize to support that family. We care through practical means. Within this congregation, there are grandparents, there are aunties, there are uncles, there are educators, there are mentors, there's support, there's people who can bring meals and support. Within every congregation, there is the resource to care for that family who's caring for that child. Let me talk I'm getting closer to the end. Another Way Home is a program that we just have been developing at Zoe's house. It's called Another Way Home. And this program is a foster, adopt only pathway to bring children into our families. There are lots of barriers for children to come into families, especially through foster care. And we want to help bypass some of those barriers by mobilizing families to say yes and mobilizing their communities to say yes as well. So they are empowered to say yes and do it for the long haul, for the 10 years, the 20 years, even sometimes the 30 years. So when I was first asked to come with Zoe's house and help develop this program, we're focusing specifically on Kansas and Missouri. So in Kansas, there are 500, let me make sure I got the states right. Kansas, there's 500 kids waiting right now, eligible for adoption. And in Missouri, there's 2,000 kids tonight eligible for adoption. When I was asked, develop this program, my initial response was, heck no, that is so hard. Do you know how much it takes to do one kid? Randy said he was tired with 10. I'm as tired with 1. I don't know for sure, but I am it's hard. It's hard to parent. It's hard to raise up a child. It's hard to break the yoke of trauma when it's in your 6-foot radius 24/7 and believe for restoration. It's hard work. Now, the kids that are waiting are usually over 8 years old in a sibling set with severe behavior or trauma, and they're hard to place kids. So when I think of 2,000 in Missouri and 500 in Kansas, I'm like, that's too hard. And the Lord rebuked me. Because I have trained for this. I work now as a therapist. I work with foster and adoptive families with trauma and attachment. I've worked on the nonprofit side, the professional side, and the personal side. And I said, we can't do this. And the Lord rebuked me. And he said, I am doing something new. Stop relying on your old ways. The experience I gave you 10 years is not the experience for today. Say yes again. So this is my yes. We're doing this. We are seeking churches. Right now, we're just kind of at the point to actually launch into this. Really, if we could put numbers to it, we are seeking a church, one church that would say yes. And within that church, 3 families that would say yes. 3 families that would say, I would bring the children into my home, and the church to say, we will care for those families. Not all are called to adopt, but all are called to care. Like I said, there's many expressions, and there are practical ways to respond. I'm going to give you 5 practical ways to respond. I'm just going to kind of shoot them off. You can think about them or let the Lord just highlight what he may be asking or speaking to you. Number 1, watch Sound of Hope. There is a movie out called Sound of Hope that shows the power of prayer and the power of community. And they literally emptied the foster care system in that county. And they did it weekly, like weak, opposite of strength. Weekly. That movie, I groaned through that movie because it wasn't rose-colored glasses. It was hard. And they showed the hard. Number 2, pray. I was in a prayer movement praying for this for over 14 years, and I saw things shift in courtrooms that no man could shift. No amount of money, no amount of power, or no amount of persuasive words could shift. What would shift in courtrooms? And in courtrooms, when kids' destinies are laid before judges and a judge gets to make the decision, either the trajectory is going to be in alignment with the judge of judges, or it's going to be out of alignment. And I have watched, because we've prayed, a shift happen and kids get into their destiny. Pray. There's a website called Adopt US Kids, and you can go state by state and look at kids right now who are waiting for families and pray for them by name. There's a small group of us that have just started praying on Thursday mornings at the Loft. We would love to invite anybody who wants to come join us then, but pray. That's 2. Number 3, some of you are called to adopt. Adopt. Say yes. You can do it. I was so poor. I'm still single. I am weak. I'm sassy. The Lord can use you. He can, I promise you, He can use you. If you are called to this, He will supply all of your needs. Number 4, support a family. If you know a family right now who's adopting, do anything to help. There are practical ways. Google it, how to support an adoptive family. I could list off 15 ways, but use what you have in your hands. Remember, okay, this is how I extend the King with my hands. Use what you have to give and strengthen a family. And number 5, I just added this one, prepare. Some of you, you might not make a move today, but you can read an article about trauma. Beyond what He's doing with the orphan and foster kids, the Lord is creating a refuge for the traumatized in the church. We are a traumatized people. We are a traumatized globe. And trauma distorts truth and reality. It's a major hindrance to the gospel. And we have to learn how to heal. The Lord has healing available for us. He wants the church as a refuge for the traumatized. For you and for those who still have not yet come in. There's ones missing from our family. They're not safe here. So prepare. Empowered to Connect is a good resource. There's podcasts, The Connected Child. Ask, we can give you some more. So that's my 5 practicals. In closing, let me see if I put a closing on here. Oh, here. The very last sentence in what I read earlier, Matthew 25, verse 40, the King replied, I tell you, whatever you did to the least of these, you did it to me. And I can't imagine my life when the Lord, through His divine editing process, erases the sin I've repented for, and He shows me every cup of cold water, every extended hand, and He looks at me and He said, you did it for me, Amber. You did it for me. That was me. It wasn't Kaylin. And this is my worship to my King. And this calling on my life has been heavy in seasons. It's been really, really hard in seasons. But as I was preparing and just kind of looking through the years, if it had not been for this calling, I would not know the Father the way I know Him. This is an invitation to know Him. And the Lord, I was thinking about our breakthrough seasons. And because of this calling, not the burden, the gift of this calling, I know the Father. I know the Mother. I've embodied the mother heart of God. It's weird. I know the Deliverer. I know the Deliverer. I know the Healer. I know the Faithful One. I know the one who will never leave or forsake me or my kid. I know the rivers of justice that flow through cities and unlock prison doors. I've seen it. I've had a front row seat, and I believe it. So I just want to make this invitation for all of us. Remember, caring for the least. Caring is not a calling. It is a characteristic of the righteous, and we are the righteous. So be intentional. It doesn't have to look the same, but be intentional. There are ways for you to connect with your King in this hour. That's it.
Thank you, Amber. Caring for the needy is not a calling, it's a characteristic of the righteous. When you said that, I was done. Okay. When you said that, it is a characteristic of the righteous. They teach you in preacher school to put a nice little bow on things when it's over. I skipped that day. I don't think there's a pretty bow to put on this. I think there is a tension to live in because tension pulls us places. My prayer for you this morning is that when you go and you sit over your lunch today, you think about what you're going to do with your lunch. With what the Lord has given you, or maybe what you have stockpiled or you've prepared, whatever it is, you've said you've got a plan for that, and he is saying, would you give it up? And if you gave it up, would you believe what I could do with it? Let me challenge you. Have these awkward conversations. Wrestle through it. Ask on that list of 5, which of these can we actually do? God is not calling everyone to adopt. He's calling some. And I don't want to put a bow on this service and release the tension from your heart. I want you to wrestle with this. Because this is what the Lord is calling us to as a church. And I don't want to miss it. So, Father, I thank you that we are adopted, that you embraced us and took us in. And we ask that we could reflect the beauty of what you have done for us here on earth by opening our hearts to children. Father, for those this morning that are feeling this call of how can we pray, how can we lean in, how can we give, that you would give them ideas and creativity. And for those that you are speaking to today in the next couple of days about adopting, that you would give them great strength and fortitude, and that they would have our pledge that we will stand with them in their yes, and they will not stand alone. We love you, Jesus. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. Go have uncomfortable conversations.